Hello and welcome to the second episode of this series that is being brought to you by the Foundation for Rural Integrated Enterprise and Development, FRIEND. As we know, FRIEND is an NGO born out of the chaos of 2000, and for the past 2 decades, they've been making efforts towards building a sustainable and peaceful Fiji for future generations. And in order to build a sustainable future, we need to look back and learn from our lessons and acknowledge our strengths and weaknesses as a nation. This Fiji Day, as we know, we launched a series of reflections from eminent persons on the past 51 years. And today is the second episode where we are joined by former politician, former senator, and former deputy prime minister of Fiji in the Labour government, Professor Tupeni, who currently is a professor in education at the University of Fiji. And also joining us is Professor Vijay Naidu, who has served at the University of the South Pacific in various senior positions, including as Professor of Development Studies. And of course, he is currently an adjunct professor in the USP School of Law and Social Sciences. Gentlemen, both of you, welcome to today's panel discussion. And I'll start with you, Dr. Bama. The first question to you is, let's look at the role of Girmitias post-independence, post-1970. And what if those 60,000 plus Girmitias hadn't come to Fiji? What would Fiji had been without them?
It's difficult to imagine. Imagine that. I do not know what would have happened. Probably the Australia would have tried to take a much greater role in the sugar industry. Probably run it like it ran Queensland and all the other plantations. It would really be very, very difficult to imagine, without the Girmitias coming here. The Fiji would have been very, very different. We had a lot of colonial people who wanted to maintain some excuse for being for the Indo-Fijians and Tauke to get together and in Parliament and in various other places. Those would be some of the things that I imagine would have happened at the time.
Professor Vijay, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, the indentured laborers were the people who were the backbone of the Fiji sugar industry, which was in turn the backbone of the Fijian economy. But the Girmitias also worked in other plantations and in public works, and when they were freed, became tenant and contract farmers, as well as the initial entrepreneurs, in the private sector in transport. And so they've been very integral to Fiji's development. And like Professor Bamba said, it's very hard to imagine Fiji without them. But having said that, countries like Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea did not have Asian indentured laborers or laborers for anywhere else. They have developed, and so the nature of development certainly would have been very different.
Professor Bamba, do you think race relations or problem within the two ethnic races was there back then in the Girmit era?
It was, the presence of the colonials over here was very evident in relations between the colonials and us, between the Fijian chiefs and the colonials, particularly colonial leaders. They got on very well, but I think the common Fijian didn't know too much about the relationship, the importance of a one-to-one relationship. The Indo-Fijians were not allowed to go into the villages. And the Taukes were confined in their koros under the chief system. And, that put a constraint on the natural relationship of people who would have liked to come on and work. I will surprise you by saying that my father attended the early schools in Dabuilevu by the church. And when he finished schooling, he went over to Watakola to do some work. And he worked in the gold mines under Mr. Dedo because he could speak in English. Yeah, he had a role in there. And when I was born, he was still in Watakola. And Watakola was a village of three, one for the colonials and one for the whites and one for the coloreds in the various provinces, right? And the Part Europeans also were all together in there. I do not know which side they were on, you see. So that would have developed, that was the first stable working area that the Tokay ever had. And my father was able to get in there because he went to school in Dabuilevu and spoke English a little bit. And I remember when I was small, I used to get gifts from Watakola coming from my father. And everybody used to call me Dedo. Dedo in Fijians means Dedo, because my father was working for Mr. Dedo. So before I got into the Bavanda situation, I was called Reto when I was small. And I get gifts that my father got me from Watakola, very kind of boats that you can screw on the side and then it just let it go and then it run on its own. So those were the things. And I didn't know what Watakola was like at the time. The division in the races, the settlements and all that. And presumably there were a number of Indians, Indo-Fijians, who were in the, trucks and stuff like that, also involved, but not many.
Professor Naidu, what does Girimet literature tell us on ethnic relations back then?
See, the thing is that, as Professor Bamba has pointed out, there was segregation of the races. So it's separate, inverted commas, development. Indian indentured laborers were forbidden from living in the Fijian villages.
That's right.
And ethnic Fijians would be prosecuted if they, the word was harbor, indentured laborers in the villages.
Yes.
Although obviously some did live in the villages. And the other point to mention is that the Fijians, the indigenous Fijians, Tokay, were never consulted about bringing in Pacific Island laborers or Indian laborers. And Council of Chiefs actually expressed grave concern about the arrival of Indians because they said, well, what would the future look like over here? And so there was that concern about the evolving situation. And of course, as the demographics of the country change, there was increasing antagonism and hostility towards Indo-Fijians. When you bring the politics into it after 1920s, then the Indian political leaders were wanting common role and were against the unequal treatment of the so-called races. I just want to make this point that the idea of race is actually a British, concoction.
Of course.
Because if you look at the Grimitias, they came from all over India. In India, they actually differentiate different language groups, different cultural groups, different religious groups. They were a very diverse lot. So whether they belong to one race is a matter of some debate. And likewise, indigenous Fijians were a very mixed group amongst themselves. So you had people with strong Polynesian background and people who were more mainstream Melanesian. The hierarchies in the East were much, higher, and the chiefs were very, like sacred. Whereas in the interior of the main island and in the West, the chiefs were, equal, amongst equals. So it wasn't a big deal, so more like Melanesia rather than Polynesia.
Yes. Professor Bamba, do you think politics was the root of ethnic tension, like Dr. Naidu mentioned around 1920s?
Yes, it was very clear that, but you must remember that the Indo-Fijians accepted what the Legislative Council prescribed. That was that they could be voted by their own people and come over to the Legislative Council. But it was the Fijians had a lot of difficulty with that because they were instructed very, very clearly from Skuna and everybody else that it was better for them to be on their own, and they resisted it. And even Raskuna, didn't so. If he had wanted the Fijian members of parliament to be elected, he would have supported that. But there was nothing in that. That would have replaced the chiefs, and it would spoil the hierarchy that was designed for them. The one element I need to say was, I remember that my father, after that, when he went back to the village, he wanted to come to Suva, and he had a lot of difficulty. He had to pay a tax. A tax to leave the village, you had to pay tax. It's called Solini Ngalala. Ngalala means freedom, to leave the village. They were not free in the village in a way. They were not free to move anywhere. They will move only within the prescribed routes, like going to Somosomo for those of us from the Kondrove, or we're going to Nanduri for the people. We also share the Nanduri Madwata relationship, where we go to Nanduri for the meetings of the chiefs there. So they were also, the Fijians were very much prescribed in where they would go, and the tithes to the province kept them working very hard in some of the plantations later on to get their tithes paid. This is the Soli Niasana, the Soli provincial tax. And that kind of, if you were free, then you were bound by some other taxation from the Asana, which is from the Fijian administration. The Council of Chiefs was kept alive once the signing of the deed of cession was done. And the chiefs continued to meet, and they advised the colonial government what system was there to be in place. So that's why it's very difficult to remove the chiefless system from the Tauke administration. And everybody knows that. Vijay would know very, very, very much from the writings of our colleague, Mrs. Durutalo, who studied the Great Council of Chiefs, how reluctant the Great Council of Chiefs were in any other changes to the administration.
Professor Naidu, could the chiefs and the politicians find a midway somewhere to ensure that things did not go wrong racially in the country?
You see, one very important factor that is not in the questions and has not been raised this far is the role of the white man. There were 3 or 4 very powerful white men, which include the Scott family, the Hestrom, and others, who actually decided how things worked out in Fiji. And of course, CSR was very, very powerful in influencing government. And the white people in Fiji never constituted above 2% of the population of the country, and yet had parity in representation in the legislature, and were the first to be represented in the executive council of the colonial government, long before Fijians were, and long before Indians, Indo-Fijians were. So these minority whites actually played the chiefs against Indians in order to preserve their own privileges.
Yes.
And if you look at the 1970 Constitution,
Yes.
they were a minority, but what they did, they got the part Europeans who had previously been denigrated and had negative stereotypes against them. They brought them into the fold. And then they brought the Chinese into the fold. So the Chinese also became honorary white in Fiji. So this larger group, which still did not, extend to 3 or 4% of the population, actually ended up having 15% of the seats in parliament on independence. And so they always had this balance of forces. And it is not unique to Fiji, because in Kenya, they played the same game against East Indians. So a reason for the divisions in Fiji is not just the chiefs and the Indians, but actually the role that the white men played. And afterwards, the general electors played. And that went all the way to the 1987 coup, actually.
That's right.
And so we got to be mindful of that.
Yes.
And I'd like to just reinforce what Professor Bamba said about the restraints and controls on ordinary Fijians. Ordinary Fijians, and I deliberately use the word segregation and apartheid. Fijians were separated by rules and regulations that control the minutiae of their life, including when they woke up, when they faced the firewood, when they went to the plantations, what kind of work they did outside of the villages. So they were directed to go and join the clergy or the public service or be short-term laborers in the Vatukola gold mines. So this was determined, whereas the other ethnicities were allowed to just go and do whatever they wanted to, free for all, with little restraint.
That's right.
So that by the 1960s, hardly any ordinary indigenous Fijians had bank accounts, for instance.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Professor Bamba, why do you think the chiefs could not counter these restrictions back then for their people?
Dr. Durtalo's thesis made it very, very clear that, it worked in favor of the chiefs.
Don't know.
The maintenance of the Great Council of Chiefs, beside a kind of an advisory role on the executive of the Legislative Council to run the country. So that was that. And in fact, the Fijian were among the first where they worked. They move around, but in the Vatukola, they were required to settle, and they were settled in rows according to their sanas, provinces, clans, and that stuff like that. So they were kind of organized, and when there was a strike, which is very clear in Dr. Bain's book, Labor and Gold, they would bring one of the big chiefs and discourage and spoke in Fijian to them and tell them, look, it's very important for you to start to work, get back to work. So they were reprimanded by the chiefs. And I remember Ratu Sir George, Ratu Penaya, and all the others, for those who have not read that book, Labor and Gold, Dr. Bain, is a fantastic portrayal of what was going on in Vatukola.
Professor Naidu,
Thank you.
Professor Naidu, do you think it's okay to blame the descendants of Girmitius or Girmit for the racial tension in the country that we currently sometimes talk about?
Not at all. Not at all. You see, I just want to reinforce what Professor Bamba said. There was a system of indirect rule for Fijians, and the chiefs were big beneficiaries of this.
Yes.
And while the colonizers and the Europeans played the music, the chiefs danced to the tune.
That's right.
And compelled the people to stay.
That's right.
And both Simeone and Alumita have written about the
Yes.
role of the chiefs. And
That's right.
they were not promoting democracy. They were not promoting the freedom of ordinary Fijians. And in Vatukola, there were segregated settlements. The
That's
white
right.
men on the hill, mixed race and
Yes.
Rotumans on the slopes, and the black people in the bottom. And that was the nature of colonial racism.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and what the Indo-Fijian leaders did, beginning from the indentured period with Dr. Manilal Manaklal
Manilal. Yes.
and Sadhu Basis Muni,
Yes.
they tried to, argue for decent treatment of people,
Yes.
for equality, what
Right.
we now call human rights.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
in those days they did not talk about human rights, but they talk about equality.
Yes.
And that was what the white people were against. And related to what Professor Bamba said, in relation to industrial action, as you
Yes.
know, right from the Girmit days, there were
Yes.
industrial actions taken by Girmitians.
That's right.
And
That's
in the
right.
1920s particularly, there were
Yes.
strikes in the sugar mill,
That's right.
amongst the farmers and the
That's right.
municipal workers here in Suva and Nasori.
That's
But
right.
each time the colonizers used cab labor,
Yes.
and they appealed to Australia and New Zealand. In the 1920 strike, those New Zealanders actually
Yes.
sent a naval boat,
Yes. That's
and they
right.
shot one of the Indians, who
Hmm.
was striking. And unfortunately, in terms of race relations, besides the chiefs discouraging strike,
Yes.
two other things happen. They would use indigenous Fijians as scab labor
Yes. Yes.
to break the strike,
Yeah.
and therefore that would create animosity. They
Absolutely.
use the armed native constabulary to also
Constabulary.
intimidate people,
That's right.
And again, there's an ethnic dimension there.
Yes.
And so all along, all the way to the 1959 Suva strike, the chiefs had
Yes.
the role of actually keeping Fijians and Indians
Yes.
divided.
That's
You
right.
see, it suited very well colonial
Yeah.
capitalism to play the race card each time there
That's
was
right.
industrial action, because that way you denied workers, increased
Yes.
pay, better terms and conditions. It suited the system. And unfortunately, the chiefs were part of the system.
Can I just follow on from there, Vijay? You went on to a little bit of politics of representation and so forth. In around about 1929, there was the Legislative Council allowed suggested to the Indo-Fijian group and to the Toke group that they must elect their own representative. And the chiefs were very, very upset about that. They didn't want that to work. And you remember, the Indians had the election in 1929. And I remember my Naveen Maharaj, my friend Naveen Maharaj's father was elected, that one. I think there were 2 or 3 Indian representatives.
Three of them.
We were denied having that election. We didn't have an election until just before the
Independence.
the independence. We for the first time we went to election 1965, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
That's just the pre kind of government that was preparing people for the election and for election for the localization of the people of Fiji to take over the reins. The Fijians were not in a situation right there. They were not allowed to elect their own leaders. I think it's important for us to know that.
Yes.
So what point in time do you think the chiefs decided that, no, we have to have a voice and we have to speak on behalf of our people?
They had continued from the beginning. But, when the kind of election came, they were worried about the impact of that because the people, there were some educated Fijians coming up. They would have represented the Fijians very, very well. There were people in the West, Apisai Tora and others. Some people, the West were well prepared. Whereas for those of us from the East, except perhaps for those of us in Maduata, when the election against Ratu Penea, we elected the local person, and the Ratu Penea lost that election. And that was the first chief that lost the election in any part of Fiji, was Ratu Penea, who was the paramount, paramount chief. He lost to a soldier, Atunaisa, right? From near Lambasa, in that seat. So we were denied, organizing ourselves for elections, for whatever of the reasons that I've mentioned already, and it's well documented. But we never got the learn to struggle and organize ourselves. This is why when Bavandra came in, and he had a number of good people coming in, and they were very good. I was one of the Bavandra's people who, Mr. Naidu, Richard Naidu, Vijay, and all the others that came in later who supported us. It was of great concern to the hierarchy at the time, because it upset the plan.
Professor Naidu, do you think if the chiefs of Fiji had started embracing the Girimit descendants in Fiji way back before the independence and also after independence, we wouldn't be talking about race relations in Fiji currently?
Well, that is speculative. The problem was that, see, the chiefs confused their interests with the interests of the so-called race.
Right.
And basically were very patronizing, took on board what the colonialists were thinking, and basically self-serving. They did not want democracy for ordinary Fijians. They don't want them to be, free to make their choices. And they said they're not ready yet, right from Ratu Sukuna's time. They're not ready yet, they're not ready yet. Professor Bamba has pointed out, it wasn't until 5 years before independence that indigenous Fijians and women got to vote. For the first, we talk about being, having a tutelage for democracy. And what had happened, because the representation in Fiji's colonial period was communal.
Yes.
So after the 1929, elections and things, there was a walkout by the 3 Indian representatives, and then there was some reform, and the reform was that there'd be 3 elected and 2 nominated members for Indians and for Europeans, and for Fijians they all will be nominated by the chiefs. So that situation went all the way to almost, well, to 1960s actually, 1963.
Yes.
So when you say about chiefs reaching out, the chiefs were always concerned about how the voting would go in order to protect themselves. And they always had this hostility towards Indo-Fijians generally. And this is quite clearly shown in the 1946 Legislative Council debate, when the Legislative Councillor Reg put up this proposal that in Fiji, the paramountcy of indigenous Fijians have to be respected. So that was a ploy to keep the Indians in their place and to ensure European privileges would be maintained. And the Indian MPs assured indigenous Fijians that for evermore, indigenous paramountcy would be respected. This is your country. We will respect that. And we will never challenge the ownership of land in Fiji. The customary owned land will be left intact for indigenous Fijians to decide upon.
Mhm.
And I think it was Pandit Vishnu Dev who made that speech.
Yes,
Very powerful speech,
yes,
just assuring indigenous Fijian leaders that there was no intent. What Indian tenants and Indo-Fijian farmers wanted was security of tenure,
yeah, that's right.
which with the establishment of NLTB in 1940
Yes,
began to be a reality. Not long as people wanted, but for 30 years they got
yes,
secure tenure. But you see, that message, which most Indo-Fijians have accepted, was never really relayed to ordinary Fijians. And there's always been that distrust. You got to watch the Kenya because you don't know what he's up to. Very few Fijian chiefs got this message to their people. Look, these people are not here to take the land away, as in the case of New Zealand and Australia and the US, Hawaii, where migrants had taken over from the native people, their land, their culture, everything. But that assurance never came from the chiefs until well
yes.
into the independence era. So a little surprising that there was this distrust.
Professor Bamba, in 2016, one of those high chiefs, the chief from Rewa, Rotemu Kepa, took the initiative to get descendants of Girmit children under her wings and call them Luven Ratu, children of the high chief. Do you think that was a courageous gesture on her part to take this step?
Yeah, it's you know the Rotemumu, she does things like that. She does it out of goodwill and a religious background, very strong Catholic, and just spoken in good sense, with all the good sense, and it was received by the Fijians. It's okay, and the Tokay that understand the meaning of a statement, understand the origin of the Tokay from the Kawandra when they started talking about who should lead them and so forth, realize that came from the descendants of the Fijian leadership, right, the chiefs. And that's also how you speak politely in any assembly. You say that these are the children of so and so. It's a great pride for you to acknowledge that you are son of or daughter of, or had a bloodline coming from so and so, from one of the provinces. You remember the Pickerings claimed from the beginning, and even now, they are very much Burimasanga. They are from Rewa. Any Pickering would say that I'm from Rewa, and I'm very proud of it. So that's a great pride. And when it was done by Rotemumu and all the assembly in Rewa, it was understood among the Tokay that that's a serious statement that we should bear in mind. They had gone through the Nasilai, saving the people coming out of the boat. They had seen the Syria, they had heard the Syria, they buried them in their own soil. These people, and then they walk right over to Suva, where there was a Mr. Benes at the time, used to be responsible for receiving all the people who come by the boats. And then also ensuring the health of the grimatiers, if they needed anything. That's how the grandmother of James Anthony came. She was the survivor. The mother died, and she was the little girl that was looked after by the Benes people. Benes people were very close to Mari's brothers. They're up in the wooded area there. that's where the Banas used to live. She was brought up there, and finally, she was then required to work in deck in the place that then the home of
Henry
who was
Scott.
then the lawyer,
Henry Scott.
James Anthony, the Anthonys, right?
Yeah.
That's really where the James Scott, Morris Scott, they used to live there. That's right. And she was there, impregnated over there, and they organized somebody to come from and got married to her, and that made it more respectable. It was very, very important for respectability to be maintained by those people at the time. Mm. That was the result of that. But little do they, yeah.
Go on, sir.
Sorry.
Professor Naidu, at what point in time after independence do you think the plot was lost on race relations in Fiji that led
to?
Well,
the thing is that independence constitution had communal and cross-voting arrangements. And so the race card continued to be played. It was very useful. And the only person who challenged it was Dr. Bavandra. And which is why there was that big reaction and the military coup. Yeah? And the military, of course, has been a problem then and continues to be a problem to this day. But I just wanted to go back and express my gratitude to Ratu Isoa Damundamu, the Naturangan Natui Nodo, and Sashi Kiran.
Yes.
This is just a little bit of background from what Professor Bamba said, because it was in Namundrau Lane that the majority of the drowning victims of Syria, and there were about 57 of them, but the majority were buried in Namundrau, Vanua, in the Tuinodo district. And I remember Ratu Isoa saying that these Girmitia were buried in our soil.
Yes.
And our soil is part of us.
Yes.
And therefore, those Girmitia are part of us. That's very powerful.
Yes.
Very, very powerful. And people openly cried.
Yeah.
So that's where it started. And we are very grateful then that it went a stage further when the Vanua of Rewa also accepted and reinforced the Luveni Ratu adoption process. And of course, by 2017, one of the chiefs of Ba also extended this recognition. So this kind of grassroots movement, adoption, as Professor Bamba said, is very powerful.
Yes.
It shows the acceptance, and for me, it's more powerful than just putting a common name and imposing it on people.
That's right.
This is the recognition of being tied to the Vanua, like the Pickerings were. And so I'm very proud to regard myself as a Rewan.
Yeah. Yes.
So we have moved forward thanks to socio-economic processes, urbanization and changes. People are more and more living together, going to school together, working together, and learning about each other. And one good thing the government has done is to promote, learning of each other's language.
Yes.
Languages and cultures. And that's very important and points to a better future ahead.
Professor Bamba, the common name of Fijian, is it doing the magic it was intended to do, or do we have a far more yards to go in order to achieve what is meant to do?
it is coming through recognizing what has happened, which is a very powerful event. And adoption is the way that Fijians use when they get somebody, one tribe wanting no more person from that tribe can continue the blood of the tribe. They adopt somebody from another tribe. And that's part of the Fijian custom. That needs to be recognized very clearly. It's Fijian custom, adoption is part of it. And if we look at it, it's open for adoption. Fiji itself might decide at some point of time to use that, to encourage the Itoke to have adoption in the way they have their land, pass their land. There are a number of lands that are empty, whose descendants have died during the and they are now around near the domain and all the various parts of Fiji, that which could be used to settle people who are adopted legally by the clan. That particular clan can ask for adoption of certain people in that particular area. So I think these things, I'm sure it will develop, the goodwill will generate, and this is why it is also important for us to recognize the role of the modern chiefs, right? Because it's very difficult for you to just ignore the chiefs. There are modern chiefs like Rote Mumu. There are others, Ratu Senga Bindi, and those from VCC, who are recognized. The significance of the people they live with, they're working in their land and so forth. So that might be a way that could be looked at for the various descendants of people. There could be discussions between those people who, the numbers of which are running short of people settling their land. They could try and suggest some adoptions. But yes, I think it comes through that way. It's not seen as a colonial imposition. It is seen as something that genuinely come out of our people and the chiefs. I am no doubt accepted by the people of Rewa. Yeah, they are the people who don't have much land compared to the other people in Ba, other people in Nakonrove, other people in other parts of Fiji who have bigger land. But it's for them there is possibilities for people to be adopted. So that's one angle that I sort of want to highlight, and also to endorse and commend Rotemumu. And I had been very close to Rotemumu. She was my student when she came to have a bachelor's degree, having got a diploma from the Catholic training institution. She came to USP, and at that time she saw for herself the struggle of the students, the discussion of students, same kind of discussions we had. And I think she was able to see the significance of what was going on at the time.
Professor Naidu, so you got a little bit emotional previously, a short while ago, just on this common name of Fijian. Are you able to impart what are some of the pros and cons of the usage of that name currently?
Before I answer your question, I just want to also express my appreciation to Sashi Kiran, because Sashi was very instrumental in working with Ratu Ison Damundamu and with Rote Mumu. So she has been a beacon for the Indo-Fijian community. She's a great leader, Sashi Kiran, and she has marvelous interpersonal relations and diplomatic skills. And
Yes.
she has
Yes.
done fantastic work
I
in building bridges. Yeah. Having said that, I used to, read the Pacific Review back in the 60s, which was the National Federation Party newspaper. And I think Ratu Julian Tongonivalu
Yes.
was the editor.
Tongonivalu.
And the argument of that paper was that there should be a common name for all
Yes.
citizens of Fiji, Fijian.
Right.
Indigenous Fijians were also Fijians, but to differentiate them from the others, because indigenous, okay,
Yes.
owners
Yes.
of the land would be theirs. So it's not something that this government cooked up. I used to have a long debate with Len Asha,
Yes.
who in the Fiji Times, was Len Asha was a naturalized citizen, and he was
Yes, sir.
quite happy to just us to be Fiji citizens.
And can I just
and Fijians were
something?
yeah, and Fijians were reserved for Itoke. So Len Asha argued that we all should be happy with just Fiji citizens. But I argued with him in the Fiji Times, let us say that this wasn't the case, because we call our rugby team the Fijian team. We call any national, tournament thing Fijian. If you talk about our currency, it's Fijian. When Indo-Fijian students go to India to study, they are called Fijians.
Yeah.
You see, that's where I came from. And of course, when Timothy Bavandra became Prime Minister, one of the things that he suggested was that we go for a common name Fijian. Now, all the Prime Ministers of Fiji, including Ratumara, is on record supporting the idea of Fijian as a common name. The only person who said no was the late Lasanyangara Se. He's the only one who said no. But even Rambuka went to Australia, to Sydney, and said, "You are all KVT, you are all Fijians," to his audience there. So that's the way it's transformed. And if you look at Rewa, where Butandroka came from, and Butandroka was saying, Indians go back to India, what a transformation that has taken place. So this common name Fijian will increasingly be accepted, but there are pockets of dissent because it's seen as an imposition rather than one based on consultation with Vanua, with grassroots people. And there are, of course, some Indians who said, no, we're not Fijian, we are Indian, because they don't see the difference between ethnicity and nationality.
Absolutely.
Yeah? So, if you go to Malaysia, all people from Malaysia are Malaysians.
Yes.
You have Chinese Malaysians, Indian Malaysians, Sikh Malaysians,
That's right.
and the indigenous people are called, Malays. You see? So likewise for us, we can do similar kind of things and go forward. But there are people who talk about this imposition by the Fiji Affairs government that it's identity theft. Yeah. And we have to work together to educate these people, like we are doing with the anti-vaxxers, that, all of this is good for the country. So I've been for a common name for Fiji for a very long time, and I'm very comfortable with being called Fijian, especially outside of Fiji. Inside of Fiji, we know our ethnicity and we know our nationality.
Yes, I think that view by Professor Vijay, Professor Naidu is taken for granted all in the years at USP, right? We may talk about land and stuff like that, but the acceptance of the fact that we are from Fiji, we are Fijians, it's coming like the Ratu idea, it's gaining momentum. So I think it's gaining momentum, and the more that we'll just talk about it and encourage the people to open their eyes and see the value of that, so that it be seen it's coming as part of this process of kind of integration. We have a small economy. We even the land for sugar now, nobody's using that land. I'm living in Lowaki here. The land for Lowaki is empty now because a lot of the sugar canes not being used. And I think there is time now to begin to think carefully about adoption. There's a marriage here. One Indo-Fijian is married to the village. It was going on yesterday, right? This is one of the biggest and the cleanest village that I've seen in the whole of Fiji. It's part of Munda, VCC. They're all together. And I encourage people to see how these villages organized. I've just taken a lot of stuff to their kindergarten. And the principal of the kindergarten is an Indo-Fijian person who is aware of working in the environment here. Ratu Asenga Vindi's son was an education officer. And then I asked him, just go and see Ratu Asenga Vindi's son in Lotoka, the education officer, and get one or two to come and help them to read in it okay. You know, at the time, they didn't realize the importance of the people in the kindergarten speaking their language. Eh?
Yeah.
But all of that is past now. You know, that is, this is why I enjoy living here in the village of Lowaki, which is part of VCC. Bavandra's people are here too. All that. So I can see what you're saying, Vijay, and I think it's coming. And it's a natural thing that it's coming from the chiefs, right? And I think the time is right now, and we should not be talking about race too much. We talk about elections. Whoever who votes will determine whatever we do in the future, right? Rather than whoever, whether it's a Fijian or whatever, the race thing. I think that's the way we're going now, right? And I'm living here in Lowaki. I would say one of the biggest Fijian villages I've seen. Everybody's got good houses, and they support education. The chief is a woman here, and maybe there's something about leadership of women, because I have a Madhuata connection, where the women own land. The women have power. This is where I'm related to people of Nanduri. My grandmother from Nanduri. That's where the Madhuata comes. Ratu Soso is from Nanduri. Is related to me that way, that side, right? When I was at USP, he was always coming to see me. And when I was brought to Suva, I was brought to him because I was part of the clan, my grandmother from there. So it's that kind of thing. If I need any land there, I will go there. That's how it's done. So that kind of adoption will have to follow all sorts of creative ways.
Professor Naidu, on final thoughts, where do you see race relations in the next maybe 20 years or 30 years?
Well, I think it's important, you know, there have been a number of major reforms, one of which is the electoral system, where we no longer vote on candidates of our own race,
I think so.
Inverted commas, and we don't queue separately to go and vote according to our supposed races, you know. So that ethnic dimension and discrimination and segregation, that's a thing of the past. I think the electoral system should be reformed so that there is representation based on, say, 4 constituencies. So you have this recognition that, you know, people know the area and represent the areas, rather than this rather vague national single one constituency. So I think increasingly people will not, put ethnicity ahead of, their own priorities, the national priorities, and so on and so forth. There are still major gaps to attend to because those inequalities between the different ethnic groups in Fiji that go back to the colonial period.
Yes.
Both Professor Bamba and I mentioned the restrictions that indigenous Fijians faced with regard to entering the modern economy. They were part of the modern world, but also out of it. And the details of which we can talk about maybe some. But this meant that they were less equal than people of other ethnicities when it came to education, employment, and in professional areas, as well as in business and commerce. So those are issues that still need addressing. For ethnic groups as a whole. We know that there are wealthy indigenous Fijians, just as well as there are wealthy Indo-Fijians. But the issue is, just broadly speaking, the perception about ethnic inequality. So those issues need to be addressed. And as we address that and work together, the issues of common identity, of emphasizing ethnic issues over other issues of being neighbors, having water supply problem, electricity problem, housing issues, better pay, better education, better health services. These things will take priority over being obsessed by ethnicity or race.
Dr. Mamba, your thoughts? Where do you see race relations in the next 20 to 30 years?
I think it's getting much better now. People are beginning to talk about it more openly. When we used to be followers of Dr. Babandra, and Vijay was part of the Labour Party too, we were identified. But later on, we became, I go to SSA like I'm going to my village now. And Lowaki here is extension of SSA. And, and I agree that perhaps a big kind of constituencies, Vijay talks about, say, 4. That's big enough to enable people to know each other, where bloodlines will be recognized and so forth. And they're all Fiji citizens, all Fijians by the end of it, voting. And I think once you get that system moving, that's fantastic. That's be the vision of Bavandra, the vision of Rotemumu, and hopefully be the vision of all the Tuvendraratu, right? And all of us. We would like our children to begin to interact together and see themselves as, this is my Fiji that I've been talking about, singing about, playing sevens, winning sevens about, and cheering my team, whatever it is, all Fijians. Yep. It's so easy to see that vision, when the game is on and stuff like that. And let's move on from there.
Professor Bamba, Professor Naidu, thank you very much for speaking with us today. And those who will follow this session on Sunday, please note that the following Sunday, we will have another episode courtesy of Friend Fiji. Thank you very much, both professors, and goodbye.
Thank you. Naka.
Thank you.